Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude, Middle East Conversations. And with us we have Farideh Farhi from the Department of Political Science. Thanks for coming to talk with us about Middle East issues. First, perhaps we would talk about what you do at the Political Science Department in terms of the courses you teach and why you teach those particular courses. If you could talk about that.
I usually teach in the spring semesters, and I teach a regular course on politics in the Middle East, which is essentially a comparative analysis of various Middle Eastern countries. So it mostly focuses on internal dynamics of and the political processes in various countries in the world, in the Middle East. I try to show that there are different kinds of political system. They are not all a blob, all similar countries, and a variety within the Middle East. I have also started teaching a course on American foreign policy in the Middle East because increasingly I realized teaching the other course that there is tremendous interest in understanding the role the United States plays in the Middle East. I always tell my students for all practical purposes, United States is a Middle Eastern country. It is a country that is not only present in all its waterways, literally American aircraft carriers are almost as big as countries or city-states like Dubai or Abu Dhabi, but they're also obviously now present physically in various countries in the Middle East, and therefore need to be serviced in different ways. There is a political economy associated with American presence in the area. I like to discuss that, but also show the trajectory of American foreign policy beginning 20th century, because people have an idea that the United States was perceived the same way that it has been, or it has always been the same way. And it has not been the same way. United States had a very different role in the Middle East at the turn of the century, and its role has been transformed in fundamental ways, and I think that's a very important trajectory to be laid out.
Yeah, that's and how do you find students, like in terms of interest in the Middle East at this period?
My classes are, the capacity is 40 students, and they are usually full. So this is really amazing. These are all elective classes. Teaching 80 students in one semester that are interested in things associated with the Middle East, and I know there are other classes that are being taught on campus. So I find that to be a tremendous amount of interest. And when I began teaching the course on Middle East politics several years ago, there were, at most 15, 16, 17 students in class. Now, I usually have to allow more students than the capacity of the class, because there is interest in the Middle East, obviously, because of what has happened in the past 4 years.
And there are other courses, as you mentioned, like I teach a course on the Middle East, and sometimes I get some of your students, and probably you get some of mine as well.
Exactly.
But
and Elton Daniel teaches in history. So.
And also Elton Daniel in history, and there's also a course in the Department of Philosophy here, about Islamic philosophy. That's by Tamara Albertini. So it's good to have those that combination of courses. They reinforce one another and give the student a variety of courses that they take to be able to listen to different points of view and to read different kinds of books and so forth, to get some kind of understanding of what's going on. And this, your point is interesting as regards the U.S. It's not only an actor in terms of Middle East politics, but it is part of the Middle East for the reasons that you have pointed out.
Exactly. And I think the American government itself is having a, to come to terms with that reality itself. I don't think it perceived itself as a part of the Middle East, but it has become so. And
it worked itself into that position.
Exactly. Willingly or unwillingly, you might have. But it's a situation, you don't know. Some people think that the United States is stuck there. Others think that it is there for ulterior motives. But nevertheless, it is there. It is there. And it's a reality that all Middle Eastern countries have to come to terms with, and United States and American citizens have to come to terms with.
And that's perhaps the interest that is exhibited by students in terms of the Middle East, especially because it's not just a generalization that the U.S. is part of the Middle East and so on, but in terms of specific issues, like for instance the Palestinian issue, the Israeli issue. That conflict, Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is very important for world politics and not only regional.
But I also have a lot of students that are one way or another connected to the American military. So some of them have already had an experience in the Middle East, sort of a tangential experience, could have gone, for example, only to Kuwait and come back, not actually gone into Iraq, or have gone into Iraq but have been only in the green zone. But I also have students that are thinking about the possibility that they might be sent to Iraq, or have many friends that are already there. So there is a lot of interest also in terms of the consequences for themselves and exactly what they are getting into. In many ways, they acknowledge that coming to class is a way of trying to get that knowledge, trying to understand.
Yeah, also like there are those students who are opposed to the war and they want to know more and so on, so they take those kinds of...
exactly. Although the students who are opposed to the war usually thinks they know it all, but they really don't need to know.
Not all of them,
but yes, it is true. It is true that there are also people, but essentially most people who are taking the class want to know more, not only about, as I said, only about American action itself, but also about what Middle East is about and what were the reasons that the Middle East is so much in the news and is causing, because the kind of news that comes out of the Middle East is very, very, in many ways, extremely distorted. So the reality, or actually the conditions of everyday life and everyday politics in the Middle East is completely missed. Middle East is treated as essentially a powder cake at every level. But the reality is that you have close to 300 million people living in an area, including North Africa, that are engaged in intense politics and live their lives in many different ways. And people we have reached a point where a lot of people think it's time to learn about that.
Yeah, because of all these stereotypes.
Exactly,
and so on.
Exactly, because people have a sense, or students have a sense that, this can't be all there is to it. There must be something else, They get so much repetition of the same things over and over again, and the reality of the Middle East is presented in such unreal ways that at one point students end up saying, there must be something else there, and I want to know more.
Yeah, I interviewed Elton Daniel. We're talking about his courses. In terms of the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. So since this is one of the main problems, if not the main problem, notwithstanding Iraq and Iran at this point. So we'll watch that and then we can talk more about it.
Seems to be unchanging and unchallengeable in any respect. Now, I suppose in a certain sense, some of the aggressiveness have gone out of their sails because the U.S. has learned some very hard lessons about what it can and can't do in Iraq, and the Israelis have learned some pretty hard lessons about what they can and can't do in Lebanon, and there may be a bit of a shift towards being a bit more pragmatic. But in terms of the U.S. changing policies towards Israel, I don't see that happening. There's, of course, some talk and speculation that the U.S. is waking up to the fact that it really needs to try to show some kind of progress in resolving that conflict to improve its credibility and standing in the Arab world and the Muslim world in general. And people make some noises about that, but I'm of the school of thought that thinks that essentially this administration has reached a point where it simply can't do anything. Nothing is going to happen. There are too many political problems in Washington, there are political problems in Israel.
So, you know, the role of the United States in the peace process, I mean, it's virtually non-existent at this point. That's basically what Elton is talking about, and that there's no real change in support for Israel, that there will always be support for Israel. So how do you look at that situation?
Well, obviously, that's at the center of the kind of interest that the students essentially show in relationship to the Middle East. And I agree. I mean, the Bush administration has willingly and determinedly decided to ignore the Palestinian-Israeli issue and the Palestinian predicament on the premise that as the Israelis establish realities on the ground, the issue will be resolved. And by that, effectively, essentially, the Bush administration and the Israelis, the hardliners in Israel, think that that means essentially taking over a large chunk of the West Bank, the parts that are very important to them, through the establishment and continued building of the settlements, which are going on very, very rapidly, particularly around the Jordan Valley at this Jordan River at this point, effectively establishing what Israel wants to be the boundary that it wishes, and then unilaterally make a decision about how the situation will be resolved. They think that the peace process did not work, will not work. There is some sort of a show, you know, by Secretary Rice to suggest that there is a commitment to bringing back the roadmap, but because the Saudi government has tried very hard and has shown, many other Arab governments have effectively asked the Bush administration to become much more active on this issue, realizing the bad impact it has. But there is absolutely no will on the part of the Bush administration. And frankly speaking, the disastrous state of politics in Israel itself, where the Prime Minister faces a popularity rate of about 1.5 to 3% of the population, has created such a weak government in Israel that Israel has become a dysfunctional government, unable to respond. And of course, on the Palestinian side, you have similar dynamics, and therefore I don't see any movement on the ground except this establishment, increased settlements, increased expropriation of land on the part of the Israelis, and the international community's assent to that process.
Yeah, but it's interesting, for instance, that the Israeli public is against Aoude Olmert, who's like, to me, an extreme right-winger, because like he didn't perform well in Lebanon, you know, and even though like he and the army, the Israeli army, devastated Lebanon from north to south, east to west. What else did they want him to do? So I find this troubling in terms of the politics, in terms of Israel moving exactly to the right. Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, part of the reason that Aoude Olmert is still in power is because, I mean, if he falls, what you're going to get in Israel is probably a government that is even much more radical to the point that, you know, Olmert already has within its government not only radicals who do not want to give back any part of the West Bank, but also even want to transfer the Israeli Arabs out of Israel itself. So you will have a very, very difficult dynamics within Israel itself. Outside, you know, we're not talking about the occupied territories, but the tensions within Israel itself in terms of its minority Arab populations are also increasing. And as you suggested, because of the failures of what happened in Lebanon and the lack of preparedness for what they were trying to do, accomplish, beyond, as you said, just bombing the hell out of a country, has created a very, very difficult situation. You know, not only political, but a psychological situation for the Israelis. I mean, as you just pointed out, they have done everything that they can, you know, in terms of wreaking havoc to the, you know, in relationship to the enemies, but they still do not have security. They still do not feel secure. And this is because they do not want to deal with the fundamental issue that has undermined Israeli security, which is occupation. They want to continue occupation. That occupation is destabilizing, creating havoc for Israeli politics, but because of the lack of ability to deal with occupation, Israel remains psychologically and politically a very, very insecure place.
Yeah, and as far as the minority, the Arab minority, the Palestinian minority in Israel, who are Israeli citizens, they are like 20% of the population, so they are a hefty minority.
20, and almost at the elementary level, they are almost 25% of the population. That's a big chunk.
Yeah. And the other thing is that with regards to when this minority tries to say that, hey, we are citizens and let's be treated democratically and have democratic rights and so on, they try to counter that because they want to keep Israel as that Jewish state despite the 20-25% Arabs there. And others too, not only Jews. But the other thing is that, like lately, Azmi Bshara, who was a member of parliament and is a Palestinian from Nazareth, he resigned as a Knesset member or parliament member. And now he's out of the country, and they are charging him, the Israelis, with treason. And his talk is that, you know, what they wanted to do is any Palestinian there who wants to talk or, you know, have the discourse in terms of democracy and freedom and liberty, etc., and equal rights, the Israelis don't like to see that kind of discourse appropriated by others, by other guys other than they, you know, and therefore they want to silence the main voices of the Arab minority in Israel and deny them equal rights and so forth. So that is a dangerous game that the Israelis are playing that would create a lot of havoc and chaos beyond what they experience now inside Israeli society and politics.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that. On the question, so Israel basically, then we are in agreement, like facing two things. One, the internal dynamic within Israel, including the dynamic that relates to the Arab minority, the Palestinians there, and what is happening in the West Bank and Gaza as well, which is that's the question of occupation. Because even if Israel has vacated Gaza, it's still there, you know, in terms of troops and so forth. Yeah. On that question, I interviewed Elton Daniel again on the question of what's happening with the peace process insofar as the Palestinian side is concerned. So we listen to that and then we can talk.
Abbas's government sort of came to an understanding about the way they would approach Israel. I think they're very ready, actually, to talk and find some type of arrangement, and they've sort of taken this approach that you know they put off that question as to whether two-state or one-state solution should be what it is. They're sort of saying ideally the one-state solution is right, and we don't recognize the legitimacy of what's been done, but we have to face the facts on the ground, and so we will deal with the situation as it is. They're sort of ready to talk, but there's nobody for them to talk to. Yeah. And of course, what's really bizarre are these stories you see in the press that on another front, with Syria, the Syrians and the Israelis sort of have an understanding of what they want to do for a solution, and it's being blocked by people in Washington who don't want to see progress on these fronts. They rather radicalize things, apparently.
So that's rather interesting about the Americans vis-a-vis Syria, where perhaps the Israelis and the Syrians want to deal somehow. The Americans are blocking that. So it's kind of interesting. So any more insight on that?
Well, until recently, because, I mean, as you know, after you had the interview with Elton Daniel, there was a meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, and Condoleezza Rice had a meeting with the foreign minister of Syria for the first time, Mr. Muallim. And but yes, one of the ideas that the Bush administration has had for the past few years is that it prefers to use the idea of talking or dialogue with other countries as a bargaining chip, in a sense, or as a reward, what we want to call it, in the sense that it thinks that if it talks to countries that are not good countries or they are evil countries, it will be rewarding them. So therefore, on the Syria track, because of the dynamics in Lebanon and what happened last year, and the fact that Syria was pushed out of Lebanon, and there has been an attempt on the part of the American government to isolate the Syrian government, they have shunned this idea. The Israelis have been interested and in fact have had meeting with the Syrians, secret meetings, but the Americans have definitely come out against those meetings at one point, essentially because they have argued that any talks with Syria would reward them. Well, the Israelis have different issues with the Syrians. It has to do with Golan Heights, it has to do with Israeli security. So they are sort of caught in a very strange situation because they have been much more interested in coming up with some sort of a practical solution to their security problem with Syria, while the Americans are following this grand model of pursuing democracy or whatever in the Middle East that effectively says that there are good guys in the Middle East and there are bad guys in the Middle East, and you just don't talk to the bad guys. And this particular dynamic between Israel and Syria has been missed in this grand vision. I think there has been a little bit of change on this issue because United States since Sharm el-Sheikh, and obviously there is this reality that the taboo was broken, and Condoleezza Rice was willing to talk to the Syrian foreign minister, because there's also another group within the American government. So there are so many factions in American foreign policy making who believe that the United States should begin talking to Syria as a way to peel Syria away from Iran. So, so depending on the way it looks like who American Secretary of State talks to the night before, American foreign policy keeps shifting. But I think, I'm saying it jokingly, but I think all of these things are a reflection of the quagmire that the United States has gone into, having gone into Iraq and putting itself in a situation where there are very, very few options for United States to come out of this situation holding its head up. Just let's think about, 4 years ago, United States was claiming that it was building a new Middle East, that Iraq was going to be a beacon of democracy. Today, what we have is a total disaster in Iraq. The Israeli-Palestinian issue has gone down the tube. The relationship with Iran has deteriorated. Relationship with Saudi Arabia even, or Egypt, are on the rocks. United States has had to back off in any talking about any discussions of reform, because effectively everybody is so angry at United States. Turkey is going through its own struggle with, between Islamist and secular forces. So there is really nowhere in the Middle East where United States can come and tell us, okay, in the past 4 years, we have done this, and that we have had a little bit of success or some success somewhere. So I think this shifting positions in relationship to different countries are a reflection of the desperate situation the United States has willed itself into.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the Sharm el-Sheikh meeting, it's very interesting because Condoleezza Rice speaking on behalf of the American government, saying that we'll be meeting with the Syrians and the Iranians. They didn't meet with the Iranians, so that interesting.
Well, she didn't say she was going to meet with the Iranians, but she said, you know, I'm not going to, move away from it if the opportunity arises. Well, what happened was that, yes, well, I mean, there's the Iranian side of the story too. The Iranian foreign minister walks into the room, sees Condoleezza Rice and leaves. So, that probably was not a wise move on the part of the Iranian foreign minister, and he's getting a lot of criticism inside Iran over what he did too. But nevertheless, as you said, it's not at all clear what came out of that meeting, except the meeting with the Syrian foreign minister, which has always been desired by Syria, because Syria wants to be considered wants to get rid of these kind of pressures that are imposed on it. And if United States wants something from Syria, it has to be engaged in a give and take with Syria.
Yeah. The only thing, like if history is any indicator, is that the Americans have played with the Syrians before, and then they pulled out. And in fact, the Syrians have collaborated with the Americans on question of intelligence, like on terrorism and so on. And the Americans botched the end of the bargain. So the Syrians were so disgusted that they stopped any collaboration with the Americans on the question of terrorism. Yeah, so that is, I think, an important thing to keep in mind. I personally wouldn't put much stock in Condoleezza Rice or the Americans meeting with the Syrians, except perhaps like just to, take the pulse of the Syrians or something like that. But it takes more than just one meeting, of course, to see, and we'll see if that happens. I kind of wonder what else would the Americans, if they are interested in some kind of negotiations about the Arab-Israeli conflict, what else might they offer beyond what they have offered half-heartedly and just went down the tubes, like, the roadmap and the rest of that before and after the roadmap, for that matter. So, yeah.
No, I mean, the United States has never had anything to offer per se. What the United States has had is the determination to bring different parties to the table. That's what happened during the Clinton administration, which has not existed. And I just don't see, given the weak political position of George Bush in the United States, and as I said, the disarray that has fallen onto American foreign policy in relation to Iraq, I just cannot see, anybody within the American government developing that will to bring different parties to the table.
Yeah, so we'll move to another part, not far from Palestine. We go to Iraq, and you mentioned Iraq, etc. I talked with Elton Daniel about Iraq, and he has some kind of opinion about what's going on and why the U.S. is in Iraq.
It's very hard to say because there are a lot of different people with different motives and agendas that have been pushing a lot of aspects of Middle Eastern policy. I'll tell you, though, my own opinion, for what it's worth, is that the cat is out of the bag in terms of Iraq. That this hydrocarbon law that they've brought before the parliament is really America's priority number one. To get that passed, to privatize Iraqi oil, open it back up to American and other foreign companies to exploit. And they are rethinking their strategy as to what they have to do in order to get that through, because right now it's not as smooth sailing as they thought it was going to be. And that puts all these issues back on the table. You need quiet on the Israeli-Palestinian front. You need quiet in Lebanon. You need to tone down things a bit with Syria and Iran and try to get that through. And I think that's, you know, that's ultimately the agenda, and what they actually do over the course of the next few months is going to be geared primarily to making sure that they get that hydrocarbon law passed.
So, you know, the question of oil privatization, etc. A couple of things I want to add is that the oil workers in Iraq are about to go on strike. You know, I think on Thursday, their Thursday, which is like 13 hours ahead of us here in Hawaii. And the question of privatization is not a new thing as far as American policy in Iraq is concerned, because they tried to privatize the oil industry way before, in the early part of the occupation, the early period of the occupation. The other thing is that not only privatization of the oil, but other industries. And so far this has failed. Now they're trying to come back come inside from the window instead of the door. And so I'm just wondering what your comments are on those things.
Yeah, I mean, the initial privatization that went on under Bremer, thinking that Iraq, you know, was just the, you know, liberal capitalist haven, you know, that, you know, obviously has not developed as planned, because given the fact that Iraq is not a well-functioning, you know, secure economic state, you know, the issues related to privatization have not come to force totally. But the issue of oil, it's actually a very, very complicated and interesting issue, because first of all, it has two aspects to it. On one hand, there is the question of how to distribute revenues, okay, which, you know, goes back to this question of sectarian disagreements, the Shiites, the Kurds, and the Sunnis. And obviously, you know, as has been said over and over again, oil is mostly in the Shiite areas and the Kurdish areas. So the question of how much revenue the Sunnis will get is a very, very important and touchy issue. But then there is this other aspect that goes beyond revenue sharing. There has been an agreement on some sort of revenue sharing. What there has not been an agreement on is the question of production sharing, which is or production sharing agreements, which there is no other country in the Middle East at this point that operates under PSA. PSAs are colonial vestiges. Absolutely. That's what the Saudi, you know, that's when, you know, the American companies own the Saudi oil, or the British company own the Iranian oil or Iraqi oil. They have gone, you know, out of favor. Oil in the Middle East has become nationalized. So if Iraq moves in that direction, and I'm not as confident as Daniel that it will, because, you know, in many ways the cat is out of the bag in Iraq, in the sense that the Pandora's box has been opened, and the United States may not be able to control the situation. But you know, that is the offer that is on the table. But there is tremendous resistance in the parliament, and in fact, a very large chunk of the coalition, the Sunnis, have made a threat that if the government does not open the question of constitutional revisions very soon, they will pull out of the government. So, you know, my bet at this point is that chances of Mr. Maliki's government falling is higher, or higher than the oil law passing at this point. You know, what kind of strings the United States will pull to push this through, I do not know. But at this time, there's tremendous opposition to it.
Yeah, actually, Elton is in agreement with you, because he doesn't think it is, you know, a sure thing.
Yeah.
So let's watch his next one, because it has to do also with Iran on that particular issue.
And it creates the fear, which some people in Iran are expressing, that in fact the agenda for all of this rhetoric and hostility towards Iran is because they want to do the same thing to the Iranian oil industry that they did to the Iraqi oil industry. Yes. They want to find an excuse to be able to take it over and privatize it again.
So in fact, what I'm trying to say, though, that with that hydrocarbon law, it
would create more chaos, not only in
Oh, it
Iraq,
will. This is what I say. They, they clearly thought that they had, things under control in Iraq enough that they could slip this law through. And they've run into obstacles at every front. Some of the, of course, the people pushing it the hardest are some of the Kurdish politicians, but there are Kurdish politicians that are opposed to it. They've tried to put a sugar coating on it by, emphasizing that what it's intended to do is to distribute oil revenues fairly among the different communities in Iraq, thinking they'll get the Sunnis on board that way. That's not working. And on the Shiite side, Muqtada Assad has called their bluff and is denouncing the law. And so it's by no means a foregone conclusion that they can simply wave their magic wand and get this law.
Yeah, so, everything is still up in the air. I mean, that was your point too, yeah? I mean, in this sense, yeah.
I mean, but the fundamental reality is there, which is that Saudi Arabia has effectively reached its peak oil. The only two countries in the world that have a potential for significant increase in oil production are Iraq and Iran. Iraq, because of 20 years of mismanagement and wars, and in the case of Iran, because of effective 20 years of various sanctions on the Iranian economy that has not allowed investment in the oil and gas sectors in significant ways. Obviously, there is this other route of going around trying to increase production in these countries, which is, allowing companies to go in, invest according to the terms that are offered by the economies of those particular countries, and then obviously increase production and sell it at prices that would benefit on terms that are more beneficial to the countries involved, and of course on terms that essentially says the control of oil is in the hand of those particular countries. That, for a variety of reasons, has not been an acceptable formula for United States. For United States, control of oil is extremely important, not necessarily access to oil. I'm not one of those who thinks that the United States necessarily thinks that they should own every drop of oil in the Middle East, but I think control of the flow of oil in the Middle East is extremely important to the American government, and they have been willing to go to war on that basis. Had it not been for the quagmire in Iraq, I think they definitely had designs over Iranian oil too, but things have not turned out as they wanted
so because,
to.
these PSAs, the production sharing agreements, as you said, harkens back to oil colonialism and so on. And this law that is in Parliament, in Iraqi Parliament now, would give royalties to the Iraqis 12.5%, whereas before, when it was full production, most of the profit, all the profits were stayed in Iraq for the Iraqi people in terms of spending on healthcare, etc., until Saddam Hussein started spending it on military and other ventures with the Iraq-Iran war and so on, and destroyed Iraq before the Americans began to really devastate the infrastructure. This is some of the things like what Elton is saying, as I see it, that the Americans are interested in that particular control of oil, and they would see that it is important for them to deal with Iran as well, and that is the threat in terms towards Iran. So it's a real threat, not just perceived, but it's a real threat. And how it goes, it all depends upon what the American military would judge what's happening with them in terms of Iraq. I mean, you and I were talking about it earlier before the show, and you said that the military is not in agreement with attacking Iran because they are overstretched and so on. And they think also about the point that you made which is that Iran might be able to retaliate in ways that we do not know yet?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's important to understand that Iran is almost 3 times as big as Iraq, population-wise and geographically-wise. It is also a mountainous country. It's more like Afghanistan than it is like Iraq. So the idea of actually, any kind of invasion of Iraq, of Iran, placing boots on the ground, I think is just something that, is simply beyond the means of what is available. Obviously, the other possibility is just an aerial attack of Iran in terms of excuses connected to Iranian nuclear programs, attacks Iranian nuclear sites. Now, obviously, if United States does that, that is a declaration of war. I mean, there is nothing. And then, it's very obvious that the United States is very exposed in Iraq. It has, over 150,000 soldiers in Iraq. The Iranians are very well placed, very well connected to, their brethren, the Shiite brethren in Iraq. So, the Iranians do not need to, directly confront United States, but because of the exposure of United States in Iraq, this, attack that the United States will engage in relationship to Iran, aerial attack, will not be unanswered. And I think that is something that the American leadership, particularly in the American military, knows full well, that the attack will not be unanswered, and at the same time, in terms of the personnel, the Americans are very much limited because, this is, the numbers that they are playing with are the numbers that they are playing with in relationship to Iraq. So any expansion of that war to another country just places them in an extremely dangerous situation.
Yeah. And nuking Iran to wipe it out is not an option, because then they lose the oil that is in Iran that they are after in the first place.
I mean, this idea of nuking countries is used so flippantly, people not understanding how close everybody, it is just not, it's not, you go and nuke Isfahan, it's not as though the American soldiers in Iraq would be unharmed, it would be safe with that. Now, one could make an argument that those who are making decisions in the White House could give a hoot about American soldiers in Iraq, but the reality is that
they have to take that into account because of popular pressure,
and everything else. So I think this whole idea of countries nuking each other in the Middle East has been carried away. It's like this whole idea that the Iranian president has said that they're going to wipe Israel off the map, and we shouldn't give that president a nuclear weapon. I mean, people don't realize. I mean, he considers Israel illegitimate because of what it does to Palestine. Well, nuking Israel will get rid of Palestinians too. Is not, and all the religious sites. So people are, I think, use that language very flippantly.
Right, That's why because the right wing in the U.S. say nuke Vietnam, nuke Iran, nuke them. Like what's his name, McCain.
Exactly.
He started bomb Iran. Well, what is that?
Exactly.
So he wasn't necessarily talking about nuking, but it's
but
just.
There are some. There are some who talk about this idea of tactical nuclear weapons.
Absolutely,
And it's just not. American Federation of Scientists immediately came out with a visual presentation of what would happen in terms of where the radiations will go. And believe me, that radiation will immediately impact the American community that now lives in the Middle East.
Saudi Arabia also.
Exactly.
So that's not an option. Even like the dear friends of the U.S., the Arab dear friends of the U.S., like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, would object to it, of course.
Precisely.
So anyway, so that's another discussion I had with Elton is in terms of American policy and what's ironic about American policy. So we'll see that he talks about the 2 possibilities in terms of American policy. We'll see that, and then we'll discuss some more.
what I see as a central irony in American policy is that it has more or less created this situation in which Iran is poised very well to become the dominant regional power again, even more so than it was under the Shah. And apparently nobody in Washington had really thought through what the consequences of that happening would be or how to deal with it. And I doubt very much that they have a policy of what to do. But obviously they've created an enormous problem because countries like Saudi Arabia are so fundamentally opposed to Iran and Iranian influence that there's no telling what they might be willing to do in connection with that. And it makes it very difficult for the U.S. to have a coherent policy in dealing with it. I suppose ultimately, there are two possibilities. One is that the Bush administration is so wounded and so weakened that it's just going to coast along and really do nothing of any substance until it can dump this problem into the lap of the next administration. That's one possibility. The other possibility that you would have, though, both for the United States and in the case of a weakened ally like Israel, is that people have a tendency to compensate for that weakness by striking out in some other way to make it look like they're bold and decisive. And so you also have the possibility of more reckless adventurism to try to push through that agenda. And I don't know, it's hard for me to say, what they're really thinking or doing. Yeah. But I'm certainly concerned that, more military adventures are on the horizon.
That's a problem. Yeah, so, like it could go either way. I mean, you are of the opinion that the Americans are so weak that this is not logical for them.
It's not a question of logical, it's the question of that there is resistance to it. And the resistance is not, the peace movement. It comes from within the military, within the intelligence community. You have people that have been working on this issue, and they are effectively saying, on one hand, United States will be overstretched. On the other hand, that the intelligence that that you are cooking, you are cooking it. That we are not going to play along the same way we did last time in relationship to Iraq. So, it is that bureaucratic resistance to the American overstretch that I think will prevent it. So.
Yeah, so, but what do you make of this, that, let's say, on the domestic policy front, you have the Republicans and the Democrats. I mean, if there is like some big divide between them, but let's say there is. The Democrats are against the war in Iraq, but to show that they are really macho or whatever, even Hillary Clinton, she talks about what? Strong position on hard line on Iran, you see.
Even Barack Obama does.
Yeah, Barack.
It's true, but actually in relationship to Iran, in Washington a consensus has developed. That is to say, for the first time in a long period of time, what you have is an agreement on this approach, which they consider to be multilateral. First, imposition of sanctions from the UN on Iran's nuclear program, and at the same time increasing sanctions. The Congress is increasing sanctions, and then there are also various states in the United States pushing their various pension plans to divest from companies that are investing in Iran. So there has been an agreement on the economic squeeze and political squeeze of Iran. And I think it's going to continue. The only problem is that the Iranian economy has been limping along for the past 30 years, and the hardliners are in power in Iran, and essentially that they say, so what? We'll continue limping along for, we have more patience than you do. So the question becomes whether or not there will be a point that United States will, will run out of patience and think that this economic squeeze is not working. I just don't think that there is enough juice left in the Bush administration to do that. And I think, again, because of the resistance that comes from the bureaucracy and the military, I don't think it will move in a different... it will happen. It's just, you know, an educated guess, but you know, the possibility is there. You know, I cannot say that there is no possibility of military action.
Elton makes a similar point to what I was mentioning about the Republicans and Democrats and so on. So let's listen to that and discuss it some more.
There is no real debate over this. Both sides simply try to outdo each other in how nice they can be. And it's not just, you know, in the case of Israel. Now the Democrats are trying to sound like pacifists on the case of Iraq, and yet they don't want the American people, the voters, to perceive them as being pacifistic in nature. And so they are very belligerent in what they have to say about Iran. They all want to prove how tough they are, and they're looking for a victim that they can beat up on to do it. And so, you know, now when they're backtracking on Iraq or making, you know, dovish statements about it, they're making all these threatening statements about how tough they'll be with Iran. No, there doesn't seem to be any attempt among the major politicians to really work out some alternative policy that could restore the image of the United States and United States security. In that sense, there are a few, of course, people like Dennis Kucinich and others that have fairly radical views about what needs to be done, but they have no realistic chance of winning.
Well, I mean, just I just want to show what Elton had to say on that. But we have a caller, Taj from Oahu. You're on the air.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Hello, you're on the air. Go ahead.
I've got a comment on Professor Elton Daniel's observation that the U.S. wants privatizing oil industries in Iraq and Iran, and that is the ultimate aim of U.S. government. I strongly disagree with this, and I find Professor Elton Daniel a bit ambivalent as well. And the next observation comment, he said that it's a quagmire and the U.S. will have to possibly withdraw, and the U.S. has no way out, etc. I think if privatizing oil industry in Iraq and Iran been the prime motive, that U.S. is in Iraq and U.S. is possibly invading Iran, which is least likely, I think, then U.S. would have taken some action against Venezuela, which is nationalizing its oil industry. So instead of tackling Venezuela, Iraq is U.S. would be forcing Iraq to privatize oil, and doing that to Iran is very far-fetched and extremely unlikely. There could be 101 other reasons why the United States is in Iraq, but not to get the oil privatized, and because neither Saddam Hussein nor the Iranian regime in the past ever denied supplying oil to the U.S. So why on earth U.S. would do such sort of thing, which would be bringing the whole region and even many parts of other regions in a total catastrophic situation?
Yeah.
So I disagree with Professor Daniel.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing. I mean, Saddam Hussein was willing to deal with the Americans, but the Americans didn't want to play ball with him.
And I think that's why it's important to focus on the question of control, not question of access.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because United States is more dependent on Venezuelan oil or Canadian oil than it is dependent, right now at least. Yeah. So, but it is important. I mean, Middle East is important to United States. I mean, at one point there was the strategic conflict of, in relationship to Soviet Union, but the fundamental reason the Middle East is important to United States is oil. Now, this particular war may not have been over getting access to that oil, but the question of controlling it and making sure that it's done in ways that the United States effectively thinks is conducive to the growth of global economy and American interest, I think is a fundamental point. That has to be taken into account, even if the adventure has gone bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back to Elton Daniel on the question of the government in Iran and see what you have to say on that.
In some sense, the government in Iran is vulnerable and weak, and not entirely popular. I don't think it's as weak and unpopular as some people like to make it out that it is. But certainly there is discontent there. But the more belligerent U.S. policy is, the less chance there is of anything actually weakening or changing that government. In fact, it makes it stronger in the face of that kind of belligerence. And the other angle to it, of course, is that when you have that kind of environment, I think this may be part of what you were alluding to, the chances of somebody miscalculating and things getting out of control in ways that people didn't anticipate is very real. We had a little taste of that with the seizure of the British soldiers by Iran. Is exactly, who did that and why and what it involved is still pretty much up in the air, but at least if the press reports are true, the Bush administration had people who were jumping at the leash to start some kind of military retaliation for that, which could easily have escalated into full-scale war. And supposedly the British finally said, no, we'll find some other way of dealing with it. But, obviously it's a very tense environment, and anything could happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is an interesting thing, and we basically talked about that. But what I want to do, I want to go to another segment with Elton, and then we connect both together. And this is about beyond the region and what are the U.S. imperative for things beyond the region in terms of policy.
I think that's deliberate. In other words, not an unintended consequence of American hegemonic presence in the Middle East as a region or whatever. Because if you look, for example, at some of the articles and things that Zalmay Khalilzad wrote before he became involved in the Afghanistan affairs and then in Iraq, a number of the policy papers that he wrote had a very aggressive attitude towards China in them, and he seemed to be a proponent, in fact, of the idea that America needs to create a presence, especially in Afghanistan and Central Asia, as a way of outflanking China, putting a wedge between China and Russia. And I mean, he argued very explicitly, for example, that if there should be a problem over Taiwan in eastern part of China, we can retaliate by having these bases and things on the western flank of China. So yeah, I think this is part of their strategy, and they've successfully concealed it under the war for terror and other things for a while. But clearly, Russia is waking up to this possibility and is not happy about all these bases being established in its backyard. I don't think China is either.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a connection between what we were talking about in terms of the region and then U.S. politics beyond the region. So how do you see that, Farideh?
I mean, look, there is no doubt in my mind that the United States sees the Middle East as a very, very important part of this hegemonic vision that it had in relationship to the world. Middle East is a very important economic player in the world. United States saw its control as being very important in relationship to any other potential adversary or competitor. But one cannot underestimate the naive ideological approach of the Bush administration that overlaid this hegemonic vision, which was that we go to Iraq, people will be waiting for us with flowers and candies. We will liberate, and then Iraq will become a model, and then Iran will fall, Syria will fall, and everybody will be happy with Israel, and Middle East will be part of this global network, and then everybody will live happily after under American hegemony. That was an ideological vision that was overlaid, and one cannot underestimate that, and one cannot underestimate the destruction that this ideological veneer has brought to any hegemonic vision that the United States had in relationship to the world.
And this is a danger because of the ideological drive that the U.S. administration has, and that's where the danger lies, actually. So we are out of time. Thank you, Farideh, for coming and talking with us. And thank you, our viewers, and see you next, what is it, May, in September,
okay.
because summer we're off.
Okay, good.
School is out
Okay.
basically in a few weeks, in a few days actually. So thank you very much, and we'll see you after the summer.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah.